Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Tuesday, January 14th, 2025. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today: Biden defends foreign policy record despite raging wars. So on Monday, President Biden delivered a speech at the State Department where he defended his foreign policy record despite the raging proxy war in Ukraine and Israel's genocidal war in Gaza. Biden claimed in his speech, quote, "The United States is winning the worldwide competition compared to 4 years ago. America is stronger. Our alliances are stronger. Our adversaries and competitors are weaker," end quote. So the president claimed that the U.S. has not gone to war to make these things happen. Besides the fact that they are doing everything short of directly intervening in Ukraine, supplying all the weapons and in targeting intelligence and things like that, because you could argue that the U.S. is at war in Ukraine, but he says they didn't go to war. Well, in the Middle East, the U.S. has directly intervened, has done a lot of direct military action in support of Israel. That includes the bombing campaign in Yemen. That includes directly intervening to intercept Iranian missiles fired at Israel. That also includes bombings in Iraq and Syria against the Shia militias. Those were attacks that started up in response to the U.S. support for Israel. So the U.S. is very much at war, despite what President Biden says. The president, what else did he say here? So Biden framed in this speech, it was really something. He framed all of his foreign policy moves as a success. Even the bombing campaign against the Houthis in Yemen, which that's been going on for over a year now, and it has just escalated the situation. The Houthis are not backing down one bit. They've increased their attacks on Israel. So that's just been a complete failure, but he mentioned that along with all this stuff as if it was a success. Discussing Gaza, Biden said that Israel and Hamas are on the brink of reaching a hostage and ceasefire deal. He acknowledged that many innocent people have been killed in Gaza, killed by Israel in Gaza, but he did not take any responsibility for supporting the slaughter of Palestinians. Again, framing all of this support for Israel as such a great thing that he's done. He said that he helped Ukraine defend itself from Russia, although his administration has helped destroy that country by discouraging peace talks in the early days of the war. He's only fueled the violence by dumping all these weapons in and discouraging diplomacy. He is leaving Ukraine with no path to a military victory, but he claimed that he's laid the foundation for the Trump administration to protect the future of Ukraine. And he also claimed that he left the country in a better place to compete with China, touting the economic sanctions he imposed on Chinese tech industries. And he closed the speech by complimenting his foreign policy team, which of course includes Antony Blinken, Jake Sullivan. He said, quote, "I put together one of the most competent foreign policy teams, I would argue, in American history," end quote. So all the stuff we've seen over the past 4 years was the result of just the most competent foreign policy team in American history, which, of course, you look at the state of the world, how Biden is leaving things. It's just a complete joke for him to say that, but no lessons learned here. Same thing with Blinken in his exit interview he did with the New York Times. Just, portraying everything as a success, even though they've helped genocide. They've supported and enabled a genocide and brought the world closer to the brink of nuclear war, really than ever before, at least since the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that's something Biden himself has acknowledged, that the risk of nuclear war has been higher than at any time since the Cuban Missile Crisis yet. It's all a great big success. All right, so the next one here, this is an interesting story. Trump envoy pressured Netanyahu on Gaza deal. So President-elect Donald Trump's incoming Middle East envoy, Steve Witkoff, leaned hard on Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to get him to agree to compromises to advance a Gaza hostage and ceasefire deal, Israeli media reported on Monday. So Witkoff, who's a real estate investor, he flew to Israel from Qatar to meet with Netanyahu on Saturday. The pressure that Witkoff put on Netanyahu is being credited for the progress in negotiations in recent days, and officials from all sides are now saying that an agreement is close. I've been very skeptical of a ceasefire deal actually happening, but I'm really hoping and praying that a deal happens here. They need relief in Gaza, and they need peace, need the violence to end. So according to Haaretz, Witkoff has forced Israel to accept a plan that Netanyahu had repeatedly rejected over the past half year. Netanyahu had been pushing for a deal that only involved a temporary ceasefire, but according to these reports, the new plan would involve a full Israeli withdrawal. So still, of course, no deal has been signed or anything, so we don't know for sure if this is something Israel is going to go for, and even if they do agree to it, we won't know for sure until they actually withdraw that they're going to follow through with it. But it's just interesting here. We have these reports saying basically that Witkoff, that this incoming Trump official, has put more pressure on Netanyahu than anybody in the Biden administration has, if he's really gotten him to make some concessions here. It just goes to show how the Biden administration, they've just not put any real pressure on Netanyahu over the past year and a half to reach a deal. I mentioned, this deal that they say is on the table involves a full Israeli withdrawal. However, if you remember that story I went over yesterday, which was based on a Haaretz report from Sunday, that said that Israel was not committing to ending the war, ending the genocide for good, basically saying that they only wanted a temporary ceasefire. And that was a report from Sunday, which was the day after the meeting. So we don't know exactly, if Israel's agreed to everything here. These reports about Witkoff's pressure were kind of vague. It did not say, how he pressured him. It didn't say anything about him threatening military aid or anything, because that is the U.S. has the ability to get Israel to agree to ending the war, because it could just cut off weapons, and that would force Israel to end military operations anyway. But we don't know exactly what happened, what went down in this meeting. But there are a lot of signs. Again, there's just all these reports. There was one from Reuters that said mediators had given Israel and Hamas a final draft deal after a breakthrough in the talks that officials would be discussing on Tuesday. And so there's also a lot of pro-Netanyahu people. Israeli media pundits are like freaking out about this pressure from the Trump administration. So Netanyahu is facing a lot of domestic pressure from the opposition, from hostage families, from protesters to reach a hostage deal. But then there's also the opposition within his coalition government, which we'll get into in another story. But there is opposition to a deal within the government. But one thing I thought was interesting, this was included in the Haaretz story, is that Israeli media pundits who are, pro-Netanyahu are not happy with these reports. One guy that was quoted here, Yinan Magal, he's an Israeli talk show host. He referenced Trump's recent threats to Hamas that there would be hell to pay if hostages were not released by the inauguration. He said, quote, "He talks about hell and in the meantime sends his envoy to sign a deal. It's a deal whose impact will be very difficult. That's the truth. A cabinet minister told me we need to pray again that God will harden Pharaoh's heart," end quote. And what he was saying there, he was saying that the only hope is that Hamas rejects the deal. So he's saying that they're praying that God will harden Pharaoh's heart, somehow comparing Hamas to the Pharaoh who had the ancient, Hebrews under the bondage of slavery, which is just a crazy comparison to make. But anyway, it's good to see these types of people aren't happy. Again, hopefully there's a deal here. All right, so the next one here, Smotrich vows to oppose truce, says that it's time to cleanse Gaza. So Israeli Finance Minister Bezalel Smotrich on Monday expressed strong opposition to a hostage and ceasefire deal with Hamas amid reports that negotiations are making progress, and said that it was time for Israel to occupy and cleanse the entire Gaza Strip. So Smotrich wrote on X, quote, "The emerging deal is a catastrophe for the national security of the state of Israel. We will not be part of a surrender deal that would include releasing terrorist hostages, stopping the war, and dissolving its achievements that were bought with much blood and abandoning many hostages. This is the time to continue with all our might to occupy and cleanse the entire strip, to finally take control of humanitarian aid from Hamas, and to open the gates of hell on Gaza until Hamas surrenders completely and all the hostages are returned," end quote. So essentially what he's saying is continue, more of the same of what we've been doing in Gaza. And then later in the day, family members of hostages in Gaza entered a meeting of Israel's finance committee that was attended by Smotrich to confront him over his tweet. You can see this picture here. Smotrich is among the people sitting down, and there's all these protesters in the chamber. One protester said, quote, "The conditions are ripe. It's time for a deal. The prime minister said it. How can you, the finance minister, oppose the return of all these abductees?" End quote. So the Haaretz report said that Smotrich expressed opposition to the deal after Netanyahu shared the details of the potential agreement. Netanyahu had summoned Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, the national security minister, to brief them on the potential deal over concerns that they might quit the government if an agreement is reached. This is something Smotrich and Ben-Gvir have threatened, all along here. They don't want any kind of deal, and they have the power to bolt the coalition government, although the opposition is saying that they could bail Netanyahu out. But there's Israeli media reports are saying that they might not be so quick to quit the government, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, because they think the incoming Trump administration is going to be very open to the idea of advancing Israeli annexation in the West Bank. I suspect that could be some sort of deal this incoming Trump administration might make if they really do want to cease fire in Gaza. They might be telling them, look, calm things down in Gaza for a bit. Let's move on some territory in the West Bank, and then we'll take it from there. I think that might be possible. But anyway, the next story actually gets into some of that. So the next one here: extremist Israeli settler leaders invited to the Trump inauguration. So this article is from The Cradle. A delegation of extremist Israeli Jewish settler leaders has been invited to participate in U.S. President-elect Donald Trump's inauguration next Monday in Washington. Wow, it's Monday, or it's coming up soon. This was reported by Israel Hayam. The delegation comprises of Yesha Council Chairman and Benjamin Regional Council Head Israel Gans, and then Oronit Council Head, Yesha Council CEO Omer Rahamim. So these are all these very extremist Israeli settler organizations, and also Yossi Dagan, who's kind of one of the well-known settler leaders. The group will attend the inauguration as official guests and will hold meetings with incoming administration officials and leaders from the U.S. Jewish and evangelical Christian communities. A similar delegation attended Trump's 2017 inauguration. A council official said, quote, "Our objective is to strengthen existing connections and forge new ones. Washington's attention is elsewhere at present. Trump is focused on Greenland's sovereignty matters, not Israel's concerns in Judea and Samaria. Timing is crucial. We must proceed strategically and appropriately," end quote. So again, this is a sign that these Israeli settlers are going to have some lines into the Trump administration. And that's obvious from Mike Huckabee being appointed as the ambassador to Israel. All right, so the next one here, getting into the violence in Gaza. There's been no let up in violence amid all these reports about negotiations. Israeli attacks kill 45 Palestinians in Gaza, and there's a pretty rough picture in this story. The Israeli military continued its relentless bombing of Gaza on Monday, killing at least 45 more Palestinians across the Strip, medical sources told Al Jazeera. Israeli strikes on Monday included heavy attacks on Gaza City, including a strike on a school-turned-shelter for displaced Palestinians, which killed at least 5. 2 separate airstrikes on homes in Gaza City killed at least 5 Palestinians, and shelling by Israeli warships killed at least 2 Palestinians west of Gaza City. So very heavy attacks on Gaza City. And this picture here is a paramedic carrying a girl who was killed. She's dead in this picture. So children, it was another particularly rough day when it came to looking at the pictures coming out of Gaza. Just lots of children being killed every day, killed or maimed or wounded every single day. In southern Gaza, at least 4 Palestinians were killed by an Israeli strike on a car, and at least 1 Palestinian was killed in Khan Yunis. So again, these heavy attacks came amid these reports of progress on the hostage and ceasefire deal. Hani Mahmoud, an Al Jazeera reporter based in Deir al-Balah, said, quote, "The more we're hearing about a potential ceasefire, the higher the pace of the attacks and a surge in the airstrikes in Gaza City," end quote. So the Israeli military said that on Monday that 5 of its soldiers were killed in North Gaza that morning. And the reports say that they were in a building. They were placing explosives in a building, and the explosive detonated, and the building collapsed on them. So they were demolishing more of northern Gaza when they were killed. Not clear if it was an accident or if Hamas detonated the explosive somehow by firing a rocket or something. But it's just horrific situation that's happening here. Again, just no let up, even though these negotiations are apparently moving along. All right, so the next one here. Former U.S. official says Israel's war in Gaza is made in America. So this article is from Kyle Anzalone at the Libertarian Institute, and it's based on this big 60 Minutes report that came out Sunday night about what's happening in Gaza. And lots of Israel supporters are very upset about it. And, it's something here because they interviewed all these former U.S. officials about, and it was very critical of U.S. support for Israel and what's happening in Gaza. But this comes out the week before Biden is gone. It's like they sat on this report they didn't want to make Biden look bad during his presidency. So a former State Department official affirmed that Israel's war on Gaza is waged with weapons made in America. He gave this statement on a 60 Minutes program that detailed how casing from American bombs litter the Gaza Strip. Josh Paul, a former director in the State Department's Bureau of Political Military Affairs who resigned in protest of the Biden administration's Gaza policy, told 60 Minutes, quote, "Most of the bombs come from America, most of the technology comes from America, and all of Israel's fighter jets come from America," end quote. He continued, quote, "There is a linkage between every single bomb that is dropped in Gaza and the U.S. because every single bomb that is dropped from an American-made plane," end quote. And then he was asked, would you say these bombings are made in America? And he said yes. So Paul appeared in a segment where 60 Minutes detailed the prevalence of bomb casings in Gaza. Those casings that Palestinians use to build their homes and become toys for children often say USA. So they've used the bomb casings to build structures, and you see children playing with them. The footage.
This is the scene filmed in.
Some of it here, but it is just. You see how they're using these bomb casings for things. It's just really crazy how. I shouldn't say crazy. It's not a surprise considering what's been happening, but just kind of seeing footage like this of all these American bomb parts just littering the streets. So Paul is one of many officials who's resigned in protest over this, and it's just really despicable that all of this dissent from within the Biden administration just hasn't affected anything. All right, so the next one here, Israeli soldiers who refuse to fight in Gaza send a letter to Netanyahu. This is another one from Kyle. So there's a group of 200 Israeli soldiers who refuse to fight, and they sent a letter to Netanyahu demanding an end. So as the Israeli onslaught in Gaza drags into its 15th month, a growing number of IDF soldiers are refusing to return to the battlefield. Some say they witnessed war crimes in Gaza and no longer want to be part of the conflict that several human rights organizations have labeled a genocide. 200 Israeli soldiers signed a letter calling for Netanyahu to end the war. One of the soldiers told the AP that he walked off his post last January. He said he decided he could no longer be a part of the war in Gaza after witnessing his fellow soldiers loot and destroy Palestinian homes. A second soldier explained that he decided he would not to return after he witnessed the murder of a Palestinian teenager in one of these so-called buffer zones. So some soldiers who, we've seen this, and there's the, what do they call them? The refuseniks, the Israelis who've refused to be enlisted, refused to be conscripted to go kill Palestinians in Gaza. And it seems like there's growing dissent among soldiers who have been there as well. All right, so the next one here, Trump envoy speaks at MEK conference. So this is not a good sign. Keith Kellogg, who will serve as an envoy for the Ukraine war in the incoming Trump administration, spoke at an event in Paris over the weekend hosted by the National Council of Resistance of Iran, an organization that's led by the Mujahideen al-Khalq, or MEK, which is a cult that seeks regime change in Iran. Kellogg said at the event that the world should reinstate maximum pressure on Iran. He said, quote, "These pressures are not just kinetic, just not military force, but they must be economic and diplomatic as well." End quote. He said that there's an opportunity to change Iran for the better, but that it would not last long and that the U.S. must exploit the weaknesses that they now see. So again, MEK, if you don't know about them, very strange organization. Their background, basically, they were founded, they're like a Marxist Islamic group that started in the 1960s. They launched attacks against the Shah forces in the 1970s. They were involved in the revolution in 1979, but then they ended up clashing with the new Islamic government, carried out terrorist attacks inside Iran. They were exiled. They ended up in Iraq, and they actually sided with Iraq against Iran in the Iran-Iraq war in the 1980s. They were in Iraq for a while again, and they were involved in terrorist attacks in Iran. And because of that, because of their history, they don't have any support inside Iran, as far as I understand it. Yet a lot of hawks in the U.S. see them as their, a potential future government in Iran. And the group is led by Maryam Rajavi. Her husband started it. He's been missing since 2003. And one of the stories I linked to here is from Vice about someone who escaped the cult and talking about, what it is like living there. And they currently are based in Albania and France. In Albania, they have this big compound. I think about 3,000 people live there. It's just a very strange group. And this is who, again, you have all these these former U.S. officials that speak at these conferences. They pay very well. And Kellogg's one of them, but, he's part of this incoming Trump administration. So it's just a sign that the MEK might have a nice line into the Trump administration. And you see this picture here from Maryam Rajavi's Twitter account. Standing next to her, on her right, is Keith Kellogg. To her left is Liz Truss, who was the British Prime Minister for 3 or 4 weeks. So this is where she's landed. Another official here, all the way at the end, if you're looking at the picture on the left, is Todd Walters. And he's a retired U.S. Air Force general who was the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO until 2022 when he stepped down. So, it's just crazy that they speak at these conferences with this group that was labeled a terrorist organization by the U.S. until 2012. And let's see here, other details about the group. So they were in Iraq for a while, and then in 2012, 2013, the U.S. helped them resettle in Albania. And the U.S., I didn't know this, I just found this while I was doing some research for this article. The U.S. actually donated $20 million to the UN's refugee agency to help resettle this group in Albania. And they're suspected of cooperating with Israel in the assassinations of Iranian scientists that happened in 2012. They've cooperated with Israel in other ways as well. And there was a report from the RAND Corporation, which is funded by the Pentagon, in 2009, when they are still in Iraq, that concluded the group, quote, has many of the typical characteristics of a cult, such as authoritarian control, confiscation of assets, sexual control, including mandatory divorce and celibacy, emotional isolation, forced labor, sleep deprivation, physical abuse, and limited exit options, end quote. So this is who, you see John Bolton's a big speaker at these events, Rudy Giuliani, some other, U.S. officials, former U.S. officials, and sometimes they'll get sitting members of Congress to attend or to speak at these events. All right, so the next one here, ICJ President Salam designated as Lebanon's prime minister. This article is from Jason Ditz. Just months ago, the Western media was panning International Court of Justice President Nawaf Salam as having an anti-Israel bias. Today, he's been concurrently named prime minister designate in Lebanon, although the media's focus is less on his Israel position than on reports that Hezbollah did not support his nomination. Salam's family has a long history in politics. His grandfather founded the Reform Movement, which opposed the Ottoman-era occupation of Middle East states. His uncle Sa'el Salam held the Lebanese premiership 4 times, and more recently, his cousin Tamam Salam was prime minister from 2014 to 2016. So as far as I understand it, he was a big part of the reason why the ICJ is taking up this genocide case. So there's I don't know if him being prime minister means that whoever replaces him at the ICJ, that could impact how the genocide case goes. But either way, Israel's not happy about him being named the prime minister of Lebanon, and he's a Sunni Muslim. So the way it works in Lebanon it's been historically, in recent decades, that you have a Maronite Christian as the president, Sunni Muslim as the prime minister, and then a Shiite as the speaker of the parliament. So we'll see. And again, all the kind of focus is that this is a big loss for Hezbollah. I haven't seen much. Hezbollah was saying that, they weren't happy about certain things, but I didn't see like Hezbollah condemning it, him being prime minister directly or anything yet. But we'll see how the political situation shakes out in Lebanon. All right, the next one here, Israeli strikes in Yemen killed 15 civilians in December. So 2 rounds of Israeli airstrikes on Yemen in December killed 15 civilians and wounded 43 others. And this is according to a monthly update from the Yemen Data Project. They track all the airstrikes in Yemen each month, and they put out these updates. And they said that every Israeli airstrike in Yemen since July hit non-military civilian targets, with no Houthi military sites being bombed, resulting in an unprecedented rate of civilian harm. So they've just been hitting civilian targets. The YDP, Yemen Data Project, also recorded 13 U.S. British strikes in Yemen in the month of December and said that they resulted in no civilian casualties. They said 8 of the strikes hit Houthi military targets, and the targets of the other 5 could not be identified. So Israel's airstrikes in Yemen have focused on energy infrastructure, power plants, and ports, oil ports. And there was the one strike on December 26th on the Sana'a International Airport that killed 3 people, 3 civilians, and that was the one that almost the head of the World Health Organization was like right there when the strikes happened. He said he was almost killed. And Israel did just also launch strikes on January 10th, this past Friday. And according to media reports, they again targeted power plants and ports and killed at least 1 person. So these Israeli airstrikes on Yemen came as the Houthis stepped up their attacks on Israel. The Yemen Data Project said that December was the most active month since October 7th, 2023, for Houthi attacks aimed at Israel. The Houthis launched 15 projectiles at Israel in the month. Most of them were intercepted, but some of them got through. So again, we talked about this failed bombing campaign against the Houthis. That's a prime example right there. December was the biggest month for Houthi attacks on Israel since October 7th. And that's after a year of the U.S. bombing them. All right, so that is it for the news for today. Please go check out our viewpoints. One from Joseph Terwilliger, Sue Me Terry when FARA applies to U.S. allies. One from Ted Snyder, you can't make peace if no one is talking. One from Medea Benjamin and Nicholas J.S. Davies, Ukrainian neutrality is still the key to peace. One from Dr. Gordon Adams, when Carter killed the B-1 bomber. And one from Michael Vlahos, accepting the truth about Ukraine is the only real path to peace. So please go check all of that out. Check out our blog. And if you want to support the show, you could always help us out just by liking, subscribing, sharing it. Tell your friends about antiwar.com. Follow us on social media, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok. Just reminded me, I made a stupid error in yesterday's show. that I said Greenland was bigger than Australia, which is not true at all. Australia is significantly larger. Caitlin Johnstone actually pointed that out to me, which is, it's always cool to know that she watches this show. But Greenland is the biggest island if you don't consider Australia to be an island, but Australia is an island continent. So anyway, we'll be talking more about Greenland, I'm sure. But again, that's it. I will be back tomorrow with some more news. Let's hope for a ceasefire in Gaza. Thanks for listening.